Everything is in standby. The background hum is steady and familiar. This is a slow, tactical sci-fi story, quiet enough to follow, gentle enough to sleep through. The first thing I remember is the taste. Even through a sealed mouthpiece, it got in as a suggestion on the tongue. Dry metal. Old pennies ground into powder. The kind of taste you get when you bite your lip and don't notice until the blood is already there. The basin below the dropship looked like a dead foundry pan. Circular walls, ribbed with service gantries and vent stacks, all of it filmed in gray that wasn't snow and wasn't dust. It clung to everything with the patience of something that had time to win. In low gravity, it didn't settle right. It hung in shallow drifts and thin veils, shifting when pressure lines opened, crawling along corners like it had intent. They called it catalytic ash because that sounded like a problem you could solve with a manual and a deadline. We were the manual. I had been a combat engineer long enough to stop expecting clean definitions. In the orbital regiments, the enemy had shapes, heat signatures, hull outlines, silhouettes, and broken light. You learned to map threat into angles and distances. You learned that if you did everything right, you still got people back in pieces sometimes. Here, the threat was everywhere and nowhere. It was a film on the handrails, a grit in the hinge seals, a static bloom that made your visor flicker with false movement. We dropped into a staging pad that used to be a cargo yard. The painted numbers were still visible under the ash, like old bones under thin skin. A line of decon arches stood at the pad's edge, their sprayers frozen in place. Someone had tried to wash this place once. The effort had been recorded, signed, and abandoned. My suit locked onto the pad with a magnetic clack. The exoskeleton took my weight, and in the low gravity it felt like I could jump high enough to leave the moon. The joints whispered as they compensated, already gritty from the last job. Comms hissed, a thin line of broken signal coming and going. That was normal now. The ash threw static the way storms threw rain. Our radios survived by using brute force bursts and tight beam relays. Anything elegant died. They had us in a containment infantry configuration. That was a phrase that meant somebody had run out of ideas and decided to rename desperation. We carried breaching tools, seal phone, cutter torches, and 2 small drones each, low profile, hardened with manual fallback controls. We carried oxygen ration blocks clipped to the harness, each block stamped with a duration that was always optimistic. We carried scrub cartridges like bullets. We also carried the knowledge that automation had already tried and failed. The first waves had been drone swarms, cutter bots, remote sealers. They had slammed into the basin like a solution. They had come back as scrap, or not at all. The ash ate their sensors and bloomed their circuits into white noise. The ash didn't need intelligence. It just needed contact. Now it was our turn to provide contact. The cordon was already wide when we arrived. The official map said 20 kilometers from the rupture site. The real cordon was wherever the air smelled wrong and the pressure line started reading dirty. It moved every day. The zone expanded like a living thing trying to breathe. We walked past a row of civilian transport skiffs, parked nose to tail. Their engines were off. Their doors were sealed shut with quick weld patches. Names had been scratched into the paint with something hard. Some of the scratches were fresh, some were older, worn down by ash drift. A column of civilians stood in the lee of a cargo block, wearing thin environmental suits that looked like they were meant for warehouse spills. Not this. Their helmets were clear and fogged with breath. Their hands trembled inside cheap gloves. They didn't look at us the way civilians look at soldiers in propaganda reels. They looked at us like we were the next rung down. There were guards behind them in full armor, not combat armor, authority armor, different insignia, different posture. Their rifles were pointed low, but the barrels tracked motion without moving. We were briefed in a sealed container that still smelled faintly of fruit shipment. A projector threw a schematic onto the inside wall, the refinery throat, the subsurface processing tunnels, the rupture chamber, red zones overlaid like bruises. A containment officer spoke from behind a visor that hid his face. His voice was smooth and exhausted, like he had been rehearsing calm in front of mirrors. The ash had nested in the throat, he said. It was catalyzing against alloy supports and polymer lines. It was feeding on the facility. It was multiplying. It was not behaving like predicted. Predicted. That word always came too late. Our objective was to push the cordon another 5 kilometers outward, seal 3 major vent stacks that were burping contaminated pressure, and retrieve 2 identified core clusters in the throat. The clusters were dense accumulations where the ash was thick enough to glow on scans like coals. The officer didn't call them coals, he called them priority materials. We would enter in 2-man cells, he said. No larger formations. The tunnels were unstable, the ash messed with proximity sensors, and comms would degrade. We would use physical line reels and return markers. If we lost contact, we would return on time protocols. Time protocols meant you left when the clock told you, not when the job was done. Failure was described as unacceptable. Casualties were described as anticipated. He spoke those words in the same tone. That was the first sign that this was not a crisis. This was an administration. I checked my filter housing before we moved. The gasket had a hairline abrasion. I sealed it with a strip of polymer tape and a smear of seal foam, knowing it would hold until it didn't. My hands moved without thought. My ribs ached when I leaned. The fracture from my last drop hadn't healed clean. The suit carried me anyway. We stepped into the basin's open air. The sky above the moon was always a hard black. No haze, no clouds, just stars and the pale arc of the gas giant it orbited, hanging like a bruise. Down here, under industrial walls, the black sky didn't help. It made everything feel exposed and unprotected. It made you feel like you were working under the gaze of something that didn't care. Our boots crunched through ash. The sound was muted, swallowed by the suit's insulation. The ash didn't behave like dust. It clung, it smeared, it made a thin paste when it met the moisture of seals and breath vents. My visor's HUD painted the world with overlays: oxygen time, scrub efficiency, suit integrity, radiation equivalence, even though this wasn't radiation. Old habits of measurement. The ash registered as electrical disturbance, particulate density, chemical reactivity. It had no single warning sound. The suit gave it a flat tone, the kind used for low priority alerts. That tone would have been funny if anything was funny. We moved toward the nearest vent stack. It rose like a tower, ribbed with maintenance ladders, its mouth fitted with a pressure cap that had been blown half open. Every few minutes, it exhaled. A slow cough that pushed gray into the air, where it drifted in a lazy plume before settling. A drone preceded us, hovering low. Its camera feed flickered, compensated, stabilized. It saw the world in harsh contrast, ash glittering like a field of needles. Halfway to the stack, the drone dipped and corrected. A static bloom pulsed across my visor. For a second, a human silhouette appeared on the feed, standing in open ground, watching us. Then the feed cleared, and there was nothing. I didn't mention it. We had all seen things in the ash. The officer had called them sensor ghosts, as if naming them made them harmless. We reached the stack's base. The metal was cold enough to leach heat through suit gloves. Ash had collected in seams, thickening around bolts. The pressure cap was stuck half open by a twisted support strut. My cell partner was a medic by training, reassigned like me. He held the seal foam canister while I anchored myself with grave spikes. In low gravity, pushing against metal could send you floating. The spikes bit into the ground, vibrating as they found purchase and regolith under ash. I cut the support strut with the microtorch. The metal hissed and spat tiny sparks that hung for a moment before falling. The ash around the cut edge darkened, as if it had drunk the heat. When the strut gave way, the pressure cap shifted. A breath of contaminated air puffed out. My suit alarm chirped. Particulate spike. Scrub demand increased. We slapped the cap shut and injected seal foam into the seam. The foam expanded, hardened, adhered. It was designed for hull patches in space. Here it was a bandage on a mouth that wouldn't stop trying to breathe. The stack fell silent for a minute. Then the structure shuddered and a faint hiss resumed, leaking through microfractures. The ash didn't need big openings. It needed persistence. We moved on. As we crossed the basin, the civilian column started moving behind us, escorted by the authority guards. They carried hand tools, shovels, scrapers, and bags. Their suits were too thin. Their oxygen packs were small. They were being used to scrape ash off surfaces to reduce spread. A human broom line. I watched them in my peripheral feed and forced myself to look away. There was no tactical value in watching them die. That was the numbness I had learned. It wasn't courage. It was economy. The refinery throat was a low structure at the basin's center, built around a heavy hatch and a service ramp descending into the subsurface. The hatch was open. The ramp was lined with railings smeared gray. A sign above the entrance still glowed faintly, letters half obscured. Someone had tried to seal it once. Weld lines scarred the hatch rim. They had failed. The ash had found pathways or pressure had forced it open again. We regrouped at the throat entrance. The containment officer's voice came over comms in chopped bursts. A reminder of time protocols, a reminder of extraction windows, a reminder that our bodies were part of a schedule. Then the comms went thin and dropped out. We entered in pairs as ordered. Inside, the air was colder. The tunnel walls were coated in ash that had bonded to metal, forming a crust like frost. Our lights cut narrow cones through gray moats. In low gravity, the moats moved slowly, drifting on our own wake. The drones struggled. Their stabilizers fought static. Their feeds jittered. We laid a physical line reel behind us, a fiber cable that would guide us back when comms didn't. The cable snagged on debris and ash clumps. I unhooked it and guided it with slow hands. Every movement was slow. Not because we wanted it to be sleep compatible, but because speed created mistakes, and mistakes here were measured in breaths. We reached the first junction. A maintenance map on the wall was half melted, as if heat had licked it. The ash had etched patterns into it, delicate and branching like veins. Our sensors indicated the nearest core cluster was deeper, near the main processing chamber. We followed the tunnel. The floor sloped and became uneven. Sections had buckled, supports warped. The ash reacted with certain alloys and produced heat over time. The facility had been cooking itself since the rupture. We passed a robot carcass lodged against a wall. One of the first-wave cutter bots. Its limbs were frozen mid-reach. Its optics were clouded over with gray film. The ash had penetrated its casings and grown inside. The metal looked pitted, eaten. That was the problem with calling something ash. It made people think it was dead residue. This ash was active. It was a process. Our suit alarms remained low and constant, particulate, static, scrub demand. Then my partner's suit gave a sharper chirp. Seal abrasion, his HUD flashed. I turned. The edge of his visor seal had a thin line of gray paste where ash had worked into the gasket. The gasket flexed as he breathed. The paste moved with it, like a living wedge. He tried to wipe it away. The paste smeared, leaving more. He injected seal foam into the edge seam. The foam expanded and pushed the paste outward. For a second, it looked like it worked. Then a tremor ran through his suit as the foam hardened and the gasket shifted. The foam had stiffened it wrong. A microgap formed at the corner, and ash mist flowed in like a slow exhale. There was no dramatic spray, no visible cloud, just a slight fogging inside his visor. His breathing changed, faster, then controlled. He was trying to keep oxygen use down. We could have returned. We were still within time to retreat. The core cluster was deeper, but the schedule did not include returning empty-handed. We pressed on. The tunnel opened into a processing hall where pipes ran overhead like ribs. Some pipes were ruptured, dripping dark fluid that froze in slow beads. The ash had coated everything, turning the hall into a monochrome skeleton. Our sensors screened higher here. The particulate density spiked. Static blooms flashed across the visor in irregular pulses. In one pulse, I saw the hall as it had been. Bright lights, workers, machinery moving. The ghost lasted half a second and vanished, leaving the dead gray again. I cataloged it as a hallucination. I kept walking. The core cluster was ahead, nestled around a collapsed support column. The column's base glowed faintly on our scanner, heat generated by the catalytic reaction. Around it, the ash was thick, almost granular, like sand piled by wind. We anchored ourselves and approached. The procedure was simple in writing. Isolate the cluster, cut it free, bag it in a sealed canister, carry it out. In practice, cutting it disturbed it. The ash did not like being moved. It reacted to heat and vibration, blooming into fine clouds that overwhelmed filters. We used cold cutters first, mechanical shears and adhesive foam to bind the ash. The foam stuck, forming a crust that held some particles. Some. When I applied the cutter torch to sever a fused bracket, the ash around the cut edge flared. Not fire. A rapid chemical reaction, bright in the scanner. Heat spiked. The ash loosened and lifted into the air in a slow, billowing plume. My suit scrubber jumped. Oxygen time dropped. My partner's visor fogged further. Inside his helmet, the air was no longer clean. He didn't speak. There was no dialogue allowed in this kind of work. We communicated with hand signals and HUD flashes. His hand trembled as he signaled to continue. We worked faster, which was a mistake, but we didn't stop. The cluster came loose with a dull crack as the bracket failed. We slid it into a canister and sealed it. The canister's seal indicator turned green. Green meant it was contained. It didn't mean it was safe. We turned to leave. My partner stumbled. In low gravity, a stumble turned into a slow fall. His boot caught on a cable and he floated sideways, arms flailing for balance. His helmet struck a pipe edge. The impact was small, but the pipe was jagged with corrosion. The visor cracked. A hairline fracture spidered across the clear plate. The suit alarm went sharp. Seal compromise. He froze, staring at the crack as if watching it would keep it from spreading. His breath fogged the inside further. Ash motes drifted near the fracture, drawn by pressure differential. I grabbed him and pressed a patch over the crack. Hull tape, polymer, seal foam. My hands moved with practiced desperation. The patch stuck. The alarm dropped from sharp to constant. But the ash had already entered. It was inside his helmet now, suspended in the air he was breathing. He signaled with a slow hand, "Continue." No extraction for him, not yet. Time protocols. We still had one cluster to retrieve. We moved deeper. The second cluster was in the main throat chamber, where the rupture had been worst. The tunnel narrowed and sloped down. The walls were warmer here. The ash film was thicker, like soot baked onto metal. Comms were gone completely. Our line reel was the only tether to the surface. Halfway down, we passed a group of civilians at work. They were scraping ash off a pipe bank with hand tools, bagging it, moving it to a cart. They worked in silence. Their suits were stained gray. Their visor glass was scratched. An authority guard stood over them, rifle held across his chest. The guard's suit was clean. His filter unit was oversized. He watched their hands like a machine watching a conveyor. One civilian stopped scraping and clutched his chest. He bent double, shaking. His helmet fogged rapidly. The guard stepped forward and struck him with the rifle butt. The civilian fell, floating in low gravity, curling around his own pain. The guard didn't hesitate. He raised the rifle and fired into the civilian's visor. The shot was contained by the helmet, muffled. Blood and ash mixed in a slow, dark bloom inside the glass. The body twitched, then went still, drifting slightly until it hit the pipe bank. The other civilians kept scraping. Their hands moved faster for a moment, then returned to the same slow rhythm. The guard looked at us through his visor. His face was invisible. He pointed his rifle down the tunnel, a silent order to keep moving. That was when I understood the enemy had two fronts, the ash and the institution around it. We reached the throat chamber. It was a cavern of broken metal and collapsed supports. The roof had partially fallen, exposing raw regolith and a jagged opening above where pressure had blasted upward. Through that opening, a slice of black sky showed, stark and indifferent. The chamber's center was a crater where the refinery core had ruptured. Around the crater, ash had accumulated in thick dunes, pulsing with faint heat on scanner. The ash here was dense enough to behave differently. It clumped, it crawled, it formed structures around debris, almost like nests. Our scanner identified the second core cluster at the crater's edge, fused into a collapsed conduit bundle. We approached with grav anchors again, driving spikes into regolith. The low gravity made everything feel slow and dreamlike, but the hazard was not slowed. Time still mattered. Oxygen still ticked down. I checked my suit integrity. The abrasion I had taped earlier had worsened. The tape edge was darkening. The ash was working under it. My scrub efficiency was dropping. Filters were clogging. My partner's breathing was rough now. His helmet interior was hazy. He moved like a man underwater. We began the cut. The conduit bundle was thick. I used the torch sparingly, alternating with cold cutters. Each torch burst caused heat bloom and ash lift. The ash responded like it was waking. At one point, a section of ash dune shifted, slumping toward us in slow motion. The particles flowed like dry sand, but the scanner showed heat rising as it moved. The ash was reacting to friction, generating more. It slid against my boot and climbed the exosuit joint. The joint whined as the ash ground into it. My suit alarm chirped. Joint resistance increased. I brushed the ash away with a gloved hand. It stuck to the glove, forming a gray paste that ate at the glove's polymer surface. The glove sensor registered microdamage. I wiped my hand on the tunnel wall, smearing the ash into a gray streak. The wall hissed faintly as the ash reacted. Everything here was reactive. Everything was food. The cut completed with a final crack. The cluster loosened. Then the chamber shook. A deep, slow vibration, like a ship's hull under artillery. Dust and ash fell from above in a lazy rain. Structural collapse warning flashed on my HUD, triggered by the graph accelerometer. The roof supports were failing. The chamber was settling. The crater edge was unstable. We had minutes before the tunnel backup became blocked, if it wasn't already. We bagged the cluster in a canister. The canister seal indicator flickered before turning green. Green again. A lie of a color. We turned toward the tunnel. The ash dune behind us shifted again, larger this time. A portion of it collapsed into the crater, sending a plume of fine particles up like smoke. The plume washed over us. My suit scrubbers screamed in demand. Oxygen time dropped sharply. Scrub cartridge life plummeted. My partner staggered and dropped to one knee, slow and low gravity, like a puppet losing strings. His hands clawed at his own chest harness. His visor was opaque with fog now. He signaled, "Go." I looked at him and saw the truth plainly. He was not coming out. His helmet had been compromised too long. The ash inside was doing what it did, catalyzing against organics, turning his lungs into a slow reaction chamber. I could have tried to drag him. In low gravity, dragging was easier physically. But the tunnel was narrow and unstable, and my oxygen clock was already running short. The institution would have written him off as acceptable. The ash would have taken him regardless. I anchored my hand on his shoulder for a second. Not comfort. A confirmation of weight and reality. Then I clipped the canister to my harness and moved. The tunnel back was a slope of gray. The line reel cable guided me. I followed it with one hand, pulling myself forward with slow, controlled motion to conserve oxygen. Behind me, my partner's breathing faded into the suit audio as I moved out of range. It wasn't a dramatic fade. It was a reduction in telemetry until his signal became noise. Halfway up, the tunnel shook again. A section of ceiling collapsed ahead, spilling debris and ash into the passage. In low gravity, the debris floated down slowly, pieces turning like dead satellites. I stopped and assessed. The line cable ran under the debris pile, partially buried. My suit lights revealed a gap at the pile's edge, just wide enough for a body if I crawled and let the exosuit take abrasion. I forced myself through, using the exosuit's strength to push debris aside. The ash clung and ground into joints. The suit whined louder. Integrity warnings stacked, joint wear, seal abrasion, filter clog. On the far side, the tunnel widened slightly. My oxygen time was down to a number that no longer felt abstract. It was a countdown to suffocation. I moved faster, which burned oxygen, which shortened the countdown. There was no winning math, only choices about how to lose. At the processing hall junction, I saw another human silhouette through the static bloom, closer this time, standing in the tunnel ahead. It was my partner's height. It turned its head slowly toward me. Then the bloom cleared, and it was a hanging cable end, swaying gently in the disturbed air. Sensor ghosts. The ash liked to imitate what you feared losing. I climbed the ramp toward the throat entrance. Light from the basin seeped down, pale and harsh. As I reached the hatch, an authority squad waited at the top. Their armor was clean, their rifles were held ready. They didn't offer help. They watched me like a checkpoint watches a contaminated package. A containment handler stepped forward. He wore a suit with administrative markings and a filter unit as large as a backpack. His visor was mirrored. He scanned me with a handheld wand. The wand beeped rapidly. He scanned the canister. The wand beeped faster. He gestured to a decon lane. Two civilians in thin suits dragged a hose line toward me. Their hands shook from fatigue. Their visors were opaque with condensation. The handler spoke in a flat burst through his suit speaker. A short command. It might have been my name. It might have been a designation. I didn't respond. Dialogue didn't matter. Compliance did. They sprayed me with decon foam. The foam hissed as it hit ash-coated joints. The reaction produced heat, a faint warmth that felt obscene in this cold environment. The foam stripped some ash away, but not all. Some ash had already worked into seams. Some was inside. They guided me through an arch that blasted cold air, then through a second arch that sprayed solvent. The solvent stung through suit microleaks, a chemical bite against skin. My suit alarm kept chirping. Internal particulate detected. That was the line you didn't want to see. Internal meant it wasn't just on you, it was in you. They took the canister from my harness with gloved hands and placed it in a sealed transport box. The handler tapped his wrist console and logged it as recovered material. Recovered, not saved, not contained, recovered. The civilian column was still working in the basin. More civilians had arrived, marching from transport skiffs under guard. The cordon was being pushed outward again. The map was being redrawn, line by line, to keep the problem always just beyond the line of accountability. I was escorted to an extraction barge at the basin's edge. The barge was a long, low craft with sealed compartments and bright decon lighting. It smelled of antiseptic and wet metal. Inside, they stripped my suit in stages. Outer layers removed in sealed bags. Inner layers cut away. My skin was gray-stained, ash under fingernails, ash in hair roots. A medic scanned my lungs. The scanner displayed faint speckling, embedded particulate. He didn't react. He marked it on a tablet and moved on. They gave me a new scrub mask, thinner for transport. It felt like a joke compared to the suit. It would not protect me if the air here turned wrong. In the barge's holding bay, other containment infantry sat on benches, shoulders slumped, eyes unfocused. Some had blood on their bandages. Some had burns where ash reactions had flashed. Some had empty stares that meant their partners hadn't come back. Nobody spoke. Not because we were disciplined, because words didn't help. A handler came down the aisle and handed each of us a small data slate. It contained our after-action report template, boxes to tick, timestamps to confirm, casualty numbers to enter. The template had no field for moral injury, no field for the execution in the tunnel, no field for the feeling of leaving someone behind. I filled the required fields with slow taps. Then I opened a private log channel on the slate, hidden behind maintenance menus. Old engineer habit. The slate wasn't supposed to have that access, but nothing built by humans was perfect. I recorded a summary of what I had seen: the civilian labor columns, the execution, the comm suppression, the known design limit references I had found in the tunnel map etched by ash tiny markings on the melted maintenance board that matched old engineering recall notices I remembered from before this deployment. Those recall notices had been filed, buried, ignored. Now the ash was eating an entire moon, and the solution was to feed it people until a redesign could be installed quietly. I packaged the log into a data capsule file and encrypted it. The encryption wasn't for foreign enemies, it was for the people in the next compartment. I stared at the send icon. There were uplink points on the barge that could reach orbital relays. From there, it could reach anywhere. But uplink traffic was monitored. Unauthorized transmission from within the exclusion zone was treated as sabotage. The hazard was not the only thing that could kill you. I didn't send it. I saved it to a physical capsule instead, a small solid-state bead I could hide in my kit. Old-fashioned, hard to detect unless someone knew to look. A containment officer entered the bay later, different from the handler. Higher rank. His visor was clear enough that I could see his eyes, tired, not cruel, just practiced. He moved down the line and paused in front of me. He held out a form. Administrative recovery, it was labeled. Medical leave. Discharge pathway. Reassignment options. It was a carrot shaped like mercy. He indicated a clause on the form, non-disclosure. Acceptance of hazard exposure responsibility, a statement that all observed operational details were classified. His eyes stayed on mine, not threatening, expectant. I signed. I signed because my lungs already had ash in them, because my ribs hurt, because my suit had kept me alive just long enough to reach this pen, because I knew the institution had more patience than I did. I signed because the war here wasn't fought with bullets, it was fought with forms. They transferred me to a med compartment where bright lights made everything look surgical and unreal. A machine flushed my lungs with aerosol scrubs. It didn't remove the ash, it reduced symptoms, it bought time. The medic told me my embedded particulate count was within tolerances for continued service. He said it without irony. Tolerances were just another word for acceptable loss. I lay on the cot and listened to the barge's systems hum. The sound reminded me of ship engines in deep space, steady and indifferent. My fingers itched. When I looked, there was gray under my nails despite the scrubbing. The ash didn't wash out, it bonded, it became part of you. In the days that followed, the cordon expanded again. The official reports called it a precautionary measure. The workforce numbers were recorded in logistics language: units deployed, units lost, units rotated. The refinery throat was sealed with new layers of foam and metal plating. The plating was stamped with warning symbols and painted bright, like visibility could stop chemistry. The ash still burped through microfractures. It still drifted. It still nested where it could. The redesigned teams arrived in clean suits, escorted by authority armor. They carried new alloy supports, new filter designs, new procedures written by people who had never crawled through the throat. They installed their improvements quietly. No public acknowledgement of the old flaw. No admission that the ash had been structurally enabled. When the redesign was complete, the administration declared the basin sterile. Sterile meant controlled. It meant the ash had been reduced to a rate of spread that fit within their tolerances. The civilians who had scraped the pipes were not mentioned again. My partner's designation was listed as lost in zone, probable equipment failure. Probable, as if the cause mattered. I carried the data capsule in my kit through 2 more deployments, each time I considered sending it. Each time I imagined the uplink logs, the authority knock, the quiet disappearance. I kept it. I don't tell myself I kept it for a noble reason. I kept it because I was tired and because truth here was another hazard with no reliable filtration. Now, when I breathe, there is sometimes a faint ticking sound in my chest, like a filter housing trying to clear itself. The medics say it's residual irritation, nerves, stress. It feels mechanical. At night, when I close my eyes, I see the ash dunes shifting in low gravity, slow as a tide. I see the execution's muffled bloom inside a visor. I see my partner's hand signal, go, in the gray. The last image that stays with me is simple. In the decon bay after they stripped my suit, a medic scraped under my nails with a sterile tool. Gray paste came out in thin curls. He wiped it onto a white cloth. The cloth hissed faintly as the ash reacted with the fibers. The medic washed it for a second, expressionless, then folded the cloth and sealed it in a bag marked waste. He sealed it the way you seal anything you don't want to think about. I watched the bag go into a chute, and I understood that containment was not an action. It was a habit of hiding what keeps leaking. The end. The narrative releases its hold, leaving only calm behind. Nothing approaches, nothing shifts. Stay in this moment as long as you like.